Hello, Geoff. Thanks for joining the Toolbox for Creativity Projects conversations. And yeah,
thanks for having me, Eric. Looking forward to it.
Definitely. So, ladies and gentlemen, and all the amazing non-conforming people out there watching this is Geoff Engelstein. And if you are not familiar with his work, let me just give you a brief intro. Geoff is a professor of board game design at NYU. Geoff is also a publisher of books related to game design and development. Particularly the book Building Blocks of Tabletop Design helped me a lot during my career as a designer of games for learning and development. Also, Geoff has published 11 board game titles. Is that correct? I just read that from your Twitter feed.
Yeah, just hit 11 yesterday.
Exactly, yeah, Versailles 1919. And yeah, some examples of these games are The Dragon and Flagon, The Expanse, and your latest release, which is Versailles 1919. And of course, there is a lot more that we can say about you, Geoff, but my Zoom meeting only allows me 40 minutes. So the first question for you is, if I had said something during the short intro that may be considered misinformation about your career, please correct me. And if you want to add something more, and then we'll jump into the next question.
No, I think you covered it fairly. So the only other thing I would mention is I was on created the Ludology podcast, which has a lot of great information about game design. It's still continuing. I dropped out after 200 episodes, but you can still go back and listen to all the back episodes.
Yeah, definitely. Something that I was going to mention, probably I skipped it or is in my notes for future questions, was the book Game Tech, which is actually based on some of these podcasts, correct?
Yes. So yeah, the Game Tech book collects some of my essays about game design and also their relation to science and history and mathematics and just the different ways that games have been used over the years. So it covers a broad range of topics.
Amazing, amazing. So, and you also have a new book coming out, Geoff, which is game production, prototyping, and producing your game. So the first question, jumping right into the main topic of the conversation, is why is prototyping so important for game development?
The game comes out, I mean, you can work on a game forever in your head, or you can, even play it by yourself. But, until you get it on the table and put it in front of people and start pushing pieces around, even sometimes just with yourself, with other people, you're going to learn so much more about your game. And the vast majority of design time that you're going to be spending is in the prototype phase of iterating the design and making a new prototype. And so, I found that just a lot of the questions that I get from people is, how do I make a board, or how do I make cards? And, so there's a lot of shortcuts that I've learned over the decades on how to do that kind of stuff, and just thought it would be very useful for new and even some experienced designers on some of the tricks of the trade of getting stuff to the table as quickly as possible.
Amazing, perfect. And there is lots of information freely available on the internet. I mean, including your podcasts and all the amazing as well talks that you have given. I think the first time I came in contact with yourself, I mean your virtual self, was through a conference from GDC, and you were talking about this very specific issue of behavior, and I think it was loss aversion, and the mathematics of it as well.
That's one of my favorite topics. Actually, recently had a book came out with MIT Press last year on this topic called Achievement Relocked, where I kind of expanded beyond board games to also look at video games. But yeah, I mean, as a game designer, one of the things that's a little bit harder to do than somebody that's a filmmaker or a musician or writing an author is to, manipulate player emotions or get the players into emotional states that you want to get them into. You don't have as many tools, and because games are more open-ended, there's not as many hooks. So by using some, understanding the player psychology, there's a lot of things that you can do in your game that will make players anxious or relaxed or, excited or, whatever emotion that you're going for. And, that's also another thing, just going back to prototyping that I think is that you really will see when you actually start prototyping with other players is how emotionally the players are reacting to what you're doing. It's not just a mathematical exercise of game design. There's a lot of psychology into it as well that can only be really observed by face-to-face playing over a board.
I love this because you're saying something that actually relates to one of my next questions. And I think you agree, or I agree with you, or you agree with me. So that's why I love the comments. But the next question, Geoff, is when using this box, ToolBox for creativity, players and the game designers need to commit to creating prototypes and releasing them on specific intervals. I mean, the intervals and iterations, they can be 1 day or they can be 2 weeks, but they need to commit to releasing every time the interval is up. And the question for you is, do you think this is beneficial for the game development process, or it could be considered overkill?
I think that it's can be beneficial. I think that one of the things that really, I think it's beneficial for a couple of instances. One is I think that people, I think people will react to deadlines. I think that people, kind of change their approach, and it forces you to be accountable, to say, hey, look, within 3 days, I want to have another prototype. I know for me, I tend to get a lot of work done right before I go to a game conference where I know I'm going to be showing prototypes to people. It's amazing how quickly I can get stuff done when I've got a looming deadline. So I think that setting those times can be really helpful from that perspective, just from from any type of work. But I think also from a creative endeavor, like design, that constraints can really help enhance your creativity. And constraints can take many forms. You could set yourself an idea like, I'm going to design a game that only has 18 cards, or I want to design a game that people who whatever I want to design a game that emulates a certain type of thing, or generates this type of emotion, or can be played by people that are blind as well as people that are sighted. Setting up these kind of constraints for yourself can inspire creativity, where sometimes just having an absolute blank piece of paper can be very intimidating, and sometimes can lead you to wander around in a lot of different directions. And one form that a constraint takes is, a time deadline. If I know I have to do something in 48 hours, then, I think it may inspire me to do certain things. You mentioned my game, The Expanse. That was actually done on a contract basis for a specific company, and they wanted the design completed in 12 weeks to get ready for production, which is a very tight design time frame typically for a board game. But having that time constraint made me be creative in certain ways. It cut off other avenues. I knew I couldn't be totally innovative, but it forced me to modify my process that I think resulted in a better game. So yeah, I think you're on the right track with that, and having people be accountable and committing to specific deadlines can be really helpful.
Perfect. And these points you mentioned about the constraints, of course, this has been studied, by many people, those who study human behavior, and how it impacts our productivity. But one of the things that the box does is the first iterations, the materials that you get to create the first iterations are really, really simple. So it could be like sticky pads or some cards with blank, nothing at the back. So players can design their own cards and put in there, for example, with a marker or with a sticky pad, some figure, and use it for prototyping and testing. But one question I have received from people who are not used to the prototyping process is that what can they do with such basic elements? And well, I know the answer that I have given, but I wonder what answer would you give to somebody who asks such questions?
Yeah, I think you can do great things with basic elements. I mean, most of my game designs, I start with a stack of index cards, because you can do just about anything with index cards. They can make a board, they can make playing pieces, you can fold them up into things, you can tear them up into smaller pieces. I think that just starting with basic elements, you can take them in any direction. So I think that, but constraining people, but giving them the flexibility to work within that is a great way to inspire people to be creative.
Excellent. And obviously, when I'm doing my intro and guiding people on how to use the box, I do let them know that they can take elements from any other games that they may have available at home. But the idea of the experiments is to use the basic elements of the box. So they have the freedom, but they are encouraged to just follow the rules.
Yeah, and I think that one of the really interesting things about the way that you've structured it is, you're building iteration into, what you're doing, and you're kind of forcing people to have multiple versions. There's never an assumption that your first version is the final game, and that's honestly, as you mentioned, I taught courses on board game design for many years, and that's something I've always struggled with, because in a context of a college course, you've got a 14-week semester, and we meet 2 times a week, right? So, I usually structure it as having three major projects that they have to do. And that doesn't leave a lot of room for iteration, like you're talking about. And really 80% of what I do, as a game designer, for my own projects, 80-90% of the work is just iterating on the design and going back over and refining it and testing it and changing it and tweaking it, right? And that's not something that's typically taught in a board game design class, just because there's just not enough time, right? It just takes, there's just a set amount of time that it's going to take to iterate, as well as learn all the other stuff that, we're trying to, the information we're trying to teach about mechanics and history of board games and build board game knowledge. So, I think that the way that you're focusing on the iteration with this is really, really important, because, the working game designer, that's 90% of your life, and knowing how to do that and have the discipline to do that is really a really important skill.
Right. Thank you for your vote of confidence. And on that note, regarding what's like to be a board game designer, I think this, for those who are not board game designers and want to be, there is a lot of misconception about what it takes to be a board game designer. And this misconception is, in spite of all the materials that are available on the internet, trying to guide us onto what really is a board game designer. So speaking for myself, and I only started with this path of designing board games for learning and development recently, about 3 or 4 years ago. And I didn't know anything of what needed to be done. What really helped me was actually my background in managing projects. So when I started noticing the iterations and all of this, I was like, bingo, okay, so there is a lot of overlapping, and I am not going to be starting from zero.
Yeah, I think that's a valid observation. My background is in project management as well. So, those same types of techniques of iteration and of, measuring your results and trying to plan your next loop is very important on everything. As it's just, generally staying in track. I mean, it's a creative endeavor, and, things can go all over the place. I mean, like I said, I had one design that took me 12 weeks. I had another design that from the first idea to when it was actually published was 14 years it took. And I wasn't working on it continuously for 14 years like that, but, so I'd stop when I ran into a brick wall. But, you've just got to be prepared for the iteration and give yourself sometimes a little room to breathe and come up with your next concept.
Thank you for that advice. One question regarding the emotion parts that you mentioned, and this is also something that I encourage the players, the users of ToolBox for Creativity to do is, okay, prototyping, creating the prototype is one thing, but the prototype needs to be tested. So on each iteration, the players, especially when playing the game in environments which is educational, sort of university, college, or a corporate training, different people receive different versions of the box, and they're encouraged to sometimes share pieces and share feedback. But what is important is the prototyping. And after each prototyping session, after each iteration, they need to decide what to improve, what to remove from the game, because removing parts that don't work are also very important, and which elements of the game they should keep and transfer from iteration 1 to iteration 2, let's say in this case. But in order to make these decisions, the box also comes with a form that allows people to identify behaviors when the people are playing their prototype. And based on this behavior, they can identify which part of the game to apply this let's say, options that I just mentioned, which is remove, keep, or improve. And I was wondering if this is something that you did, let's say, on your latest game, Versailles, or what is your view on this?
Yeah, a couple of things, thoughts on this. I think it's a really important topic. So first is when I start a new project, I always write down like a 1-paragraph or 2-paragraph vision statement, as I like to call it, where I talk about, I don't really talk about the mechanics of the game and how it works, but I talk about, what's getting me excited about working on this project, how I want the players to feel, the stories that I want them to tell, the emotions, and just sort of general ideas of, the ages of the players and the size of the game and the length of the game, just general ideas of this is the concept that popped into my head, and this is what I want to work on. So I sit and take the time to write that down, because I think that's really important as you're testing and as you're iterating, when you're doing these play tests and you're trying to decide what parts am I going to lose, what parts am I going to keep, what do I need to add. Having that, it's very easy to get lost in the woods. Okay, it's very easy to, to lose track of where you really want to go to. So having that vision statement, I think, is really important to go back to, particularly if things really aren't working, and say, what got me excited about this? Am I really achieving these goals? And very often I go back and read it. I'm like, oh yeah, I didn't really incorporate this feature or this part of it that I thought was going to be important is really working, and you kind of focuses you on where you want to go to. And it can change. You can change your vision document. Many games I've gone back and changed it, but if you're changing it, at least you're changing it on a deliberate basis. It's not just because you're doing like a random walk and you're just getting away from your vision. You're deliberately sitting down and saying, okay, players seem to really like this area, so I'm going to focus on this, and this that I thought would be fun is not as much fun, so I'm going to downplay that. But you're doing it consciously.
Yeah. Exactly.
When you're doing play testing and you're reacting to what's happening in play tests, I have 2 slides in my my lecture about playtesting for my class. One says, always listen to your playtesters, and the second one says, never listen to your playtesters. And what I mean by that is that, playtesting is really valuable, but I find, a lot of developers, a lot of game designers, and I know some people disagree with this opinion, but I know some game designers will sit and at the end of their design, they'll have a survey that they'll want the people that played it to fill out, or they'll have a big discussion session about, what did you like, or what would you change, and get input from playtesters. Playtesters will tell you the game that, they wanted to design, that they wanted to play, which is not necessarily the game that you want to design. Right, so you've got to go back to your vision and say, these are the things that I want to design. But playtesters are incredibly valuable. I get the most value just from observing them while they're playing the game, rather than an interview after it's all over, when sometimes they forget about where they had trouble or something. If you really pay attention while people are playtesting, and that's why I don't prefer not to play along. If I'm doing a playtest, I prefer to stand back and be able to watch all the people, see where they're getting hung up and where they're what they're enjoying, and when they laugh and when they look at their phone. That's where I get the value out of playtesting, is what are they engaging with, and what are they bouncing off of, what are they finding too complicated. I'll talk to people afterwards, but most of the time that feedback of conversation, except a few people I know that really are very sharp on this particular type of thing, but your average playtester is not going to be able to elucidate their concerns in a very a very meaningful way for the designer. So you've got to take what you're seeing in a playtest and use that to drive your changes. But at the same time, don't be just like a leaf in the wind, that every time any playtester says, this didn't work for me, I didn't like this part, whatever, you're going to get that. I've had real-time games that I've tested with people where, there's lots of just dice rolling or whatever, and everyone's acting very frantically. And then at the end, someone's like, yeah, I hated this. I don't like real-time games. And, I think it should have turns. It's like, okay, fine. I appreciate your input, but, my vision is that this is going to be a real-time game, so I'm going to stick with that.
And something that I mentioned earlier on was that this game can actually be played only for the purpose of developing the game that you are wanting to develop. So you can do it alone or with your team. But when the game is used in learning environments, such as colleges, universities, or schools, or in corporations to enhance the learning of training, meaning that when you have many people working with the tool, and perhaps you have even teams, working with one box. In these cases, what the model that I have designed, what it encourages to do is that people record the playtest. And also, as you mentioned, they observe the playtest. Okay, they observe it live and they have a form, but later on, they can watch the videos they made just to observe these behaviors. And same as you, and I'm glad you agree with this, is I don't encourage people to really ask the player what they think about the game, because that can send the developers in multiple directions. So I just ask people to focus on I just ask the players, future game developers, to focus on the emotions and behaviors of the playtesters.
Yeah, video is incredibly valuable, particularly when I'm doing what are called blind playtests towards the end of the development cycle, to make sure your rules are clear and the components are clear and all that stuff. You want to put it in a box. And if it's a more complicated game, it's hard to sit there while somebody learns the game and watch them the whole time. So usually you'll just send it off to a group and say, hey, can you play this and record yourselves playing it? Yeah. Because then you can really see rules mistakes. You can see where they're getting confused. Whereas if you just ask them afterwards, you may not even know they made a rules mistake if they just write up notes on the game. But having the video can be really incredibly valuable.
Perfect. And the final question for you, Geoff, because we're coming to the end of the 40 minutes, is, and this question I was kind of not sure if I should ask it, but now that you mentioned that your background as well is in project management, here it is. Game developers have been using iterations, playtesting, and prototyping for a long time, but this is also part of all of this agile, Scrum, and design thinking techniques of project management that have become really popular, even though they are not all new, but they have become really popular in recent years for the purpose of developing products. So the question I have is, do you think game developing have influenced project management in, especially the Scrum Agile part and the design thinking, or has it been the opposite, or is kind of a living creature that is evolving?
I'm not sure how much you can really use Agile or Scrum techniques in terms of, designing a game. I think that once you're close to the end, then you can adapt them. But the problem is that I feel like, Agile and Scrum is, you try to define a sprint, right? You try to define, okay, over the next 2 weeks, this is the functionality I'm going to be, this is where I want to be. And, I guess there's elements of that you can do, but I feel like you don't really know where you're going to end up. So I think it's very hard to, specifically say, this is exactly where I want to be. I mean, if I'm doing a software development project, I spend a lot of time in the beginning defining all of the functions that the software has to do. And I can say, okay, in the next 2 weeks, I'm going to hit this function, this function, this function. It's hard to do with game design in that way because it's all integrated. When you get towards the end and you're like balancing, I need to balance these characters, or these events need to be looked at, or whatever, or I need to update the graphic design here, then yeah, then you can, I think that there's specific targets that you can set for yourself. But when you're in that early creative phase, I'm not sure how much an agile approach would really bring to the table.
Amazing. No, I just thought about the agile part is what they call the time box iterations or sprints, depending,
Yeah.
So I incorporate a little bit of that just to put structure onto the players who will be using the game. But on the other hand, the game can also be used for people who are learning project management, and you can use the game to model the principles of either agile or Scrum. So I was curious to see your opinion on this, but yeah, thank you for that honest advice. And sure. Now, Geoff, you see, this is that was my last question. So I wanted to share that you share with us about your latest projects, Versailles 1919, and as well as your latest book. where can we get them? And of course, I saw them in Board Game Geek, the advertisement for the game, but especially for us in Europe, I guess, how can we access all of this material? I mean, where can we go and buy it?
Sure. So actually, I've got two games that just released. So one is Versailles 1919, which is from GMT Games, which just came out in August. And that it should be filtering into European distribution around now. Should be able to get it. And then I've also got a game called Super Skill Pinball, which is a pinball simulation as a board game, which I'm very excited about, which just released yesterday. That is going to be released in a German publisher is releasing that under the name of Flipper Mania, I believe, but I'm not sure of the timeline of that. So I think if you want to get it immediately, you'd have to order from the US, but ultimately that's going to be released as a European version with a multi-language rulebook. So I'm excited about that. My book, so my past books, Game Tech, Building Blocks of Tabletop Game Design, and Achievement Relocked are all available on Amazon or direct from publishers. The publishers' websites. I know there's a lot of European sites where you can purchase any of those books. So hopefully you should be able to get them and not have to pay too much money.
When you did the Game Tech, and I didn't see it at the time, but I saw it recently through the background check, I suppose, for lack of a better expression, that I was doing on you. And I noticed that you ran a Kickstarter campaign for the Game Tech, and there was an option to get signed copies. But I don't think you're doing that for this latest book, Game Production, right?
Yeah, no, the Game Tech one, the game production one is just through a regular publisher. Game Tech one I self-published initially, although after that it was picked up by HarperCollins. So HarperCollins now publishes Game Tech. But the other ones, the Building Blocks and the production book, are going through CRC Press, which does a lot of technical books. They have a whole line of video games, and now they're doing a line of tabletop game books. And as I mentioned, the other one was with MIT Press. So yeah, it wasn't a whole big Kickstarter and signed copies. I went a traditional publisher route for those.
Okay, so I will have to wait for the end of Corona that you come to Europe, or that I go to the United States. So you sign my copy of the book.
I hope to be at Spiele in Essen next year. So hopefully
2021, yeah. Well, that's one more reason for me to go to Spiele Essen, so you sign the copy of the book. So Geoff, I cannot thank you enough for your advice, for your time, for everything that you're sharing with us, with me, and for ToolBox for Creativity. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Definitely, Geoff. Bye-bye. Thank you.